Well, good morning, brethren, and happy Sabbath to you all, and to those who might be tuned in as well on Zoom. Now, I'm actually filling in for Breen today, who wasn't able to make it up here for the Sabbath, so he stuck with me. And now I plan to continue the series that I have been going through on the patriarchs. Now, I did have a handout, but unfortunately I did run off some copies in time, so I'll endeavour to give you a handout next time when I speak on Jacob. Now today we're going to look at the life of perhaps the least known of the great patriarchs from the book of Genesis, Abraham's promised son Isaac. Now much of his life is overshadowed by his father Abraham and his son Jacob, who both receive a lot more coverage in the book of Genesis, not to mention his grandson Joseph. Now when I originally developed this series, I initially wasn't actually going to do a separate message on Isaac because there's just so much overlap of Isaac's life with Abraham and Jacob. Now then I thought I would do a sermonette, but as I worked on the message it steadily grew from a sermonette to a short sermon and finally into a full-length sermon. There is actually quite surprisingly a lot amount of information to explore and learn about the life of Isaac, though some of it of course will overlap with Abraham and Jacob. Now the story of Isaac is told to us from Genesis 21, where we read about his birth, through to Genesis 35, which tells us about his death at age 180. Now the bulk of his story is told in chapters 21 through to chapter 28. Now after that, Genesis just focuses on Jacob and Esau before discussing Isaac's death in chapter 35. Now Isaac was born around 1850 BC and he lived for 180 years and died around the year 1670 BC. Now when his father died, Isaac was about 75 years old and his sons Jacob and Esau were 15 years old. Now when Isaac himself died at age 180, Jacob and Esau, his sons, were 120 years old, and his grandson Joseph was 29 years old, which means that Isaac was actually still alive when Joseph was sold as a slave to Egypt. In fact, Isaac died the year before Joseph was brought out of prison and raised to the position of vizier in Egypt. Now here's a diagram of the patriarchal tree, family tree, and like I said, this will be on the handout when I give it to you next time. Now Isaac's parents were Abraham and Sarah. Now his wife Rebecca was the daughter of his much older cousin Bethuel. Now a marriage between relatives this close would later become prohibited at the time of the Exodus. Now prior to that, children from such unions did not pose the same level of genetic risk as they would later become as genetic degradation began to compound. Now we will look at one possible danger that may have already begun to emerge in the patriarchal family a little later in the message. Now Isaac's son Jacob would later marry his cousin Rachel, the daughter of Rebekah's brother Laban. Now before we look at the long anticipated birth of Isaac, let's review God's greater plan in working with the patriarchs. Now in our United Church of God booklet, The United States and Britain in Bible Prophecy, we read, God then set in motion a major aspect of his plan to offer salvation to mankind. Selecting Abraham was a crucial step in God's long-term plan to turn all nations back to him. The remainder of the Bible is woven around his plan to reconcile all humanity to himself. God chose Abraham and promised to develop his descendants into a group of influential nations chosen for the purpose of teaching and illustrating his values and way of life to the rest of the world. End of quote. Now God wanted his people to be a light on a hill to draw and attract the Gentiles to him. Now the purpose of this Abrahamic covenant is outlined 3 times in the book of Genesis. It was God's intention that all nations of the world be blessed by what he was going to do through the nations descended from Abraham. Now, God was going to use both Abraham and his seed, the nation of Israel, to bless all nations of the world through the example that they were to set as a model nation to help and bless other nations, something that won't reach its major fulfillment until after the return of Jesus Christ. Now, additionally, Jesus Christ will be a part of this seed, and his sacrifice will make salvation and eternal life in God's family available to all mankind. Now, in Genesis 13, after Abraham and Lot separated, God reiterates the promise that his descendants would become a great nation and that both Abraham and his descendants would inherit the land forever. Now, since Abraham died without inheriting the promises, as it says in Hebrews 11:13, this implies a future resurrection and eternal life if Abraham was to inherit it forever. Now, in Genesis 15, God again appeared to Abraham in a vision approximately 10 years after he has come into the land. Now, Abraham asks, how can the promise of a great nation from him be fulfilled, since at that time he had no children, and his heir at that time was his servant Eliezer. Now, the fact that Eliezer, a servant, is his heir and not his nephew Lot, who is not too far away in the land, is intriguing, but consistent with the customs of the time. A servant could be adopted and be considered part of the family, even more than a blood relative who was in the land, but not directly under the authority of the patriarch. Now, God then tells Abraham that from his own body would then become his heir. Now, God in this vision then tells Abraham to look towards the heaven and says that your descendants will be as numerous as the stars. And Abraham trusts God that he will bring it to pass, despite the fact that he's now about 85 years old. Now, God has promised Abraham a son. Now, the detail of Sarah being the mother of this child, which God promised, has not been specifically mentioned yet. Now, Sarah, who's around 75 years old at this time, is barren. Now, she's got an Egyptian maidservant by the name of Hagar. Now, in the customs of the day, if a woman was barren, she could provide a surrogate woman from her servants, and any child from this arrangement would legally be the child of the barren woman. Now, this is why she says, perhaps I shall obtain children by her. Now, rather than confirm with God if such an arrangement was what God had in mind, Sarah took matters into her own hands and convinced Abraham to go through with this. Now, a year later, when Abraham is 86, Ishmael is born. Now, when Abraham is 99 years old, some 13 years later, the Lord visibly appears to him again to further expand on the promises that he is making with Abraham. Now, God makes it clear that it is Sarah who will give birth to the son who he has promised them, and that she would become a mother of nations. Now, God changes the name of both Abram and Sarai to Abraham and Sarah to emphasize the promise that he has made to them. Now, Abraham falls on his face before God and laughs as he thinks to himself, shall Sarah have a child at 90 years old? He then tries to convince God to work the promises through Ishmael, who he is very fond of as his only son at this point. Now, God tells him no, Sarah will bear a child and he will establish the birthright covenant through him. Now, having noticed Abraham's reaction of laughter, God has a thought in response to that. He tells Abraham, I want you to name him Isaac, which is a name that means laughter. Now, in Genesis 21, God follows through on his promise to give Abraham a son through Isaac, and Isaac is miraculously born when Abraham is 100 years old. Now, Sarah is 90 years old, and she loves the name Isaac that God has chosen for him, for she says, God has made me laugh, and all who hear will laugh with me. Now, the birth of Isaac literally was a miracle because Sarah was well beyond childbearing age. Now, later in the same chapter, chapter 21, when Isaac is weaned, Abraham holds a feast. Now, after Sarah overhears Ishmael scoffing in derision, probably because he is no longer the centre of attention, Sarah snaps and asks Abraham to cast out Hagar and Ishmael. Now, Abraham is reluctant to do so because he loves Ishmael, but God tells him to let Sarah have her way in this matter and that he would look after Ishmael after they leave Abraham. Now, after Hagar and Ishmael depart, God promises Hagar that he would make a great nation from Ishmael. Now, the descendants of Ishmael today became the people that we know as the Arabs. And that promise of a great nation was fulfilled in the time from the 600s AD on, when the Arab Empire expanded to a size that was even greater than the Roman Empire. Now, have a think about that. If Ishmael becoming a great nation meant an empire larger in area than the Roman Empire, then how much greater are the birthright promises that God promised would come through Isaac's descendants? Now, a number of years pass by as Isaac grows up. And then we read in Genesis 22 that God decides to test Abraham. Now, we know from the account of Abraham in Genesis that he has visibly appeared to him on several occasions, plus another in vision, not counting a possible appearance in Genesis 12 in Haran. Now, God talks to Abraham here, though this may be another visible appearance. And God tells Abraham to take his only son. Now, remember, Ishmael and Hagar have previously been sent away, and to offer Isaac as a burnt sacrifice. Now, notice that is to happen on one of the mountains in the land of Moriah. It does not specifically say Mount Moriah, something that is just assumed by many scholars today. Now, imagine your reaction if God asked you to do such a thing, to sacrifice your only son. Now, shock and disbelief, no doubt, would have been his very first reaction. In verse 3, it then simply says that he got ready and did what God had told him to. Now, was it as simple and matter of fact as this concise account might lead us to believe? Now, he no doubt would have initially struggled greatly emotionally with this strange, out-of-character request from God. Now, Abraham had to be sure that God and not some other spirit being from the dark side was requesting this from him. But once sure on that point, Abraham knew that God had promised nations would come specifically through Isaac, not some other replacement son down the track. Now, as the wheels turned in his head, he concluded that the only way that God could possibly fulfill that promise if he slew Isaac as a burnt sacrifice would be if God were to resurrect Isaac afterwards. Now, what you have to realise about how brave a decision this was to obey God here was that there was no precedent. At this point in time in man's history, no one has ever been resurrected physically back to life. Now, the very first example of this that we read about in the Bible is when Elijah will raise up a widow's son. Now, the Bible doesn't exactly tell us how old Isaac was here at the time. Now, he is referred to as a lad in most translations, but this word in the Hebrew can also mean a young man. Now, it is assumed that this mountain in the land of Moriah was where the Temple Mount is today. But since it is a type of God offering up his son, it may have happened where Jesus himself was killed. Now, there is some good symbolic evidence strongly implied in Hebrews 13, pointing to the Mount of Olives as being the place where the crucifixion occurred, as this was where the sin offerings and the red heifer were killed in Jerusalem to the east of the temple. Now, did Abraham eventually tell Isaac what he was commanded by God to do, and did Isaac submit to it willingly? Well, the chances are actually pretty high with both of these things actually happened, even though Scripture is silent about it. Now, given what would later happen on the cross, we can see how, in hindsight, that God offering up Isaac was a type of God the Father offering up his only son. And part of the reason why God asked him to do this seemingly out of character request from him. Now we know that Jesus willingly submitted to what the Father had decreed should happen to pay for our sins. And Isaac was a type of Jesus giving up his life for us. So it is highly likely that, like Jesus, Isaac submitted willingly to what God had asked Abraham to do, given that he was probably old enough to overpower his elderly father if he didn't want to go through with it. Now remember, Jesus too could easily have backed out of what he was asked to do. He said he could call on 12 legions of angels if he decided against going through with sacrificing his life. Now, if Isaac did offer to lay down his life willingly, what an incredibly courageous and faithful act that was on Isaac's part. Now, had Abraham gone through with Abraham would have gone through with slaying Isaac were it not for the intervention of an angel telling him to stop. And then God provided a ram to sacrifice instead that was caught in a thicket. Now, the highly probable willingness of Isaac to lay down his life brings us to our first lesson that we can learn from Isaac's life. Now, assuming this was the case, that first lesson is be submissive to the Father's will, like Isaac, who is willing to give up his life to obey God. Now, he showed tremendous respect and faith in what God was doing and was willing to do the ultimate act of submission in laying down his life. Now, we too need to be similarly persuaded that God knows best and be willing to make whatever sacrifice is needed to follow God. Now, some years later, in Genesis 24, Abraham wants to find a wife for his son Isaac. Now, he is insistent that he does not marry a Canaanite woman, showing a very strong preference for him to marry a woman of his own people. Now, it seems that Isaac is too busy with family and tribal matters to travel far in search of a bride, so he commissions his oldest servant to go back and find a wife for Isaac. Now, when the servant reaches the city of Nahor, which is probably Haran, as we discussed in the previous message, the servant asks God for a sign that shows that the woman has a caring, service-orientated attitude by not just offering him, but also his animals water as well from a local well. Now, there is a well in Haran today that is believed to be the location of where this important meeting actually took place. Now, the woman God selects for Isaac is Rebekah, the granddaughter of Abraham's brother Nahor. Now, she shows her caring attitude by not just giving Abraham's servant a drink, but also offering to draw water for his camels. Now, after Abraham's servant meets with all the family and tells them about his mission, Rebekah agrees to the match, returning with Abraham's servant to the land of Canaan. Now, this is basically how people got together back in the days before internet dating. Well, not really. Just an interesting case. Now, in verses 64 to 67 of Genesis 24, we read, "Then Rebekah lifted up her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, she dismounted from her camel, for she had said to the servant, 'Who is this man walking in the field to meet us?' The servant said, 'It is my master.' So she took a veil and covered herself, and the servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. Then Isaac brought her into his mother's Sarah's tent, and he took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. So we see here how he really loved Rebekah, and also how much he missed his mother Sarah. Now, in the years following Sarah's death, Abraham remarried, and his new wife Keturah bore him another 6 sons. Now, after they had come of age, it says in Genesis 25:6 that Abraham gave gifts to the sons and sent them eastward, away from Isaac his son, to the country of the east. Now, he wanted them to become patriarchs of their own rather than under the authority of Isaac. Now, the best known of those sons was Midian, whose descendants migrated further south past Petra into Arabia. Now, Moses' father Jethro was a priest of Midian. Now, Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, according to Genesis 25:20. Now, after Jacob and Esau are born, it tells us that they are born 20 years later, when Isaac is 60 years old. Now, Rebekah is probably around 10 to 20 years younger than Isaac, I would imagine. Now, verse 21 says, "Now Isaac pleaded with the Lord for his wife, because she was barren, and the Lord granted his plea, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived." Now, there was almost 20 years where she could not have children before God intervened, and she became pregnant. Now, it was actually quite a tough pregnancy, and she sought God's answer to understand why. Now, we'll see God's answer shortly, but before we do, let's look at this issue of barrenness that was an issue for each of the wives of the patriarchs. Now, this was something that actually Rick Shavey touched on in his message in Brisbane last Sabbath. Now, Sarah bore Abraham no children before the miraculous birth of Isaac. Rebekah was also barren until God healed her of her barrenness. Now, later we'll read that Jacob's wives had a similar problem. Now, Genesis 29:31 says, "When the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren." Now, Rachel was barren, and the implication here is that Leah may have been as well, since God actively opened her womb, seeing that she was the less favoured wife. Now, this issue of infertility may have been a potential consequence of marrying such close relations. Now, Sarah was Abraham's half-sister, Rebekah was the daughter of Isaac's cousin, and Rachel and Leah were both cousins to Jacob. Now, marriage between such close relations was later prohibited by God in the statutes that he gave to Moses. Now, this infertility problem, though, worked well into God's plan with the patriarchs. Now, the 12 tribes that descended from Jacob, who was later called Israel, were a miracle not just once, but 3 times over. Now, God had to miraculously intervene with 3 generations of mothers for them to be born. Now, this triply emphasised that God's election comes by God's grace and miraculous intervention, and not by merit. Now, in Genesis 25 and verses 23 to 26 we read, "And the Lord said to her," this is when God gives the reason why she's having this trouble with this pregnancy, "2 nations are in your womb. 2 people shall be separated from your body. One people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger." So when her days were fulfilled for her to give birth, indeed there were twins in her womb. And the first came out red, and he was like a hairy garment all over. So they called his name Esau. Now, Esau means hairy, and his alternate name, Edom, means red. Now, afterward his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. Now, the name Jacob, or Jacob in Hebrew, means heel catcher. Now, we'll see this later in his story, how fitting it was, as it can mean one who trips up another. Now, when Isaac is about 75 years old, his boys Esau and Jacob are 15 years old, Isaac's father Abraham dies at the ripe old age of 175. Now, he was buried in the same tomb that he purchased for his wife Sarah in Hebron in the cave of Machpelah, which means a double cave. Now, King Herod built a monumental building over that cave, which still stands to today and is open to tourists in Hebron. Now, one thing that is touching in the story about the funeral is that Ishmael was able to come back and join Isaac to bury their father. Now, in Genesis 25, we read in verse 27, "So the boys grew, and Esau was a skilled hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a mild man dwelling in tents." So we see here that Esau was the outdoors type, while Jacob was probably the more indoor scholarly type, though we'll later see that he becomes a skillful shepherd when he later moves to Haran. Now, verse 28 then goes on to say, "And Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob." So we see here the seeds of a problem that will climax with the deception regarding who is blessed to become the next patriarch of the household after Isaac dies. We see each parent having a favourite child. Isaac favours Esau, and Rebekah favours Jacob. Now, before the deception over the blessing comes an earlier incident revolving around the birthright or double portion of the inheritance of Isaac after his death. Now, prophetically, when we talk about the birthright, we often think of the blessings of national greatness. Now, Jacob and Esau here are not thinking about that long-term blessing. The birthright to them is the double portion of the inheritance from Isaac's estate. Now, in Genesis 25, starting from verse 29, we read, "Now Jacob cooked a stew, and Esau came in from the field, and he was weary. And Esau said to Jacob, 'Please feed me with that same red stew, for I am weary.' Therefore his name was called Edom. But Jacob said, 'Sell me your birthright as of this day.' And Esau said, 'Look, I'm about to die, so what is this birthright to me?' Then Jacob said, 'Swear to me as of this day.' So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. And Jacob gave Esau bread and stew of lentils, and then he ate and drank, arose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright." So we see here that Esau was more concerned with his immediate need of food and put little value on his father's inheritance, which he would not see for years. Now, Jacob valued it far more. Now, no doubt his mother had told him about the prophecy that God had shared with her that Jacob, the younger, would rule over Esau one day as the one who came out first. Now, this was no guarantee of the birthright inheritance, so he took advantage of a time of weakness for Esau when he is very hungry to bargain for the birthright. Now, in Jacob's defence, he offered to buy it from Esau. He didn't steal it from him, and Esau willingly promised it to him. Now, in the next chapter, we have another appearance of God to the patriarchs, though this one may be the first appearance of the Lord to Isaac. Now, it comes at a time of famine in Canaan when Isaac may have been tempted to go down to Egypt, as his father did soon after arriving in the land. Initially, though, he goes to Gerar, where the king of the Philistines lives. Now, God then tells him, "Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land which I shall tell you. Dwell in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and to your descendants I will give all these lands, and I'll perform the oath which I swore to Abraham your father, and I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. And I will give to your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Now God reiterates his promise to give his descendants the land of Canaan, and note the reason why. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. So God here says that Abraham kept his commandments, statutes, and laws. Now, while no doubt additional statutes were given at Mount Sinai, Abraham was familiar with God's 10 Commandments and quite a number of the statutes and other laws of God. So we see here that the law predated the covenant at Mount Sinai and was not done away with when the old covenant was replaced with the new covenant that starts with the church. And we also see with the new covenant that is later offered to the houses of Israel and Judah at the return of Jesus Christ. Now notice here the name of the Philistine king that Isaac dwelt with, Abimelech. Now you may recognise that as the same name as the Philistine king that Abraham interacted with some 80 years earlier, around when Isaac was born. Now given the time between them, they are very unlikely to be one and the same king. Now the name Abimelech is actually a title rather than a proper name. It is a compound of two words, Abi, like Abba meaning father, and Melech, the Semitic word for a king. Now there are similar king titles that we read about in the Bible for the kings of the nations around Israel. Now the best known of those is the name Pharaoh for the king of Egypt. Now the name Pharaoh means great house. Now another such king title was that of the king of Tyre, known as Hiram or Ahiram, which means benevolent brother. Now several kings of Aram or Syria were known by the title Ben-Hadad. Now Ben is the Semitic word for son, and Hadad is the chief god of the Arameans. Now Hadad itself means thunder, so Ben-Hadad means the god of thunder. Now this same god was known by different names in the ancient world amongst different peoples. Now Hadad's Canaanite equivalent was Baal. In Greece he was known as Zeus, and in Rome he was known as Jupiter. And amongst the Norse people of Scandinavia he was known as Thor, best known from the Marvel movies played by Aussie actor Chris Hemsworth. Now, when I spoke on lessons from Abraham, I discussed the reasons to conclude that the family business of the patriarchs was not primarily raising cattle and sheep, which was really only a small part of their greater business. Now, Abraham moved between four key locations on the ridge route that ran down the central highlands from north to south, the towns of Shechem, Bethel, Hebron, and Beersheba. Now Isaac appears to just concentrate his business in the south between Hebron and Beersheba. Now the town of Gerar, where Isaac moved to during the famine, is on the crossroad that goes from Beersheba down to Gaza on the coast. Now most scholars identify Tel Horor as Gerar, though Tel Sarah to its east and also along the Nahal Gerar stream is also a candidate for the town of Gerar. Now, when Isaac dwells with the Philistines at Gerar, we read what happens starting from verse 6 of Genesis 25. So Isaac dwelt in Gerar, and the men of the place asked about his wife. And he said, "She is my sister," for he was afraid to say, "She is my wife," because he thought, lest the men of the place kill me for Rebekah, because she is beautiful to behold. Now it came to pass when he had been there a long time that Abimelech, the king of the Philistines, looked through a window and saw, and there was Isaac showing endearment to Rebekah, his wife. Then Abimelech called Isaac and said, "Quite obviously she is your wife, so how could you say she is my sister?" Isaac said to him, "Because I said, lest I die on account of her." And Abimelech said, what is this that you've done to us? One of the people might have soon laid down with your wife, and you would have brought guilt upon us. So Abimelech charged all his people, saying, He who touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death. Now, as I mentioned before, given the 80-year time difference, it is very unlikely that this is the same Abimelech who had to deal with the same deception as occurred with Abraham. Now, if on the off chance it was the same Abimelech, given that the people were still able to live up to 150 years old, I can imagine his reaction would have been quite similar to that of old Biff in Back to the Future 2, when his grandson is chasing Marty around the town square and he says, "There's something very familiar about all of this." Now, like Sarah, Rebecca must have been quite a stunning woman, even in her older age. Now, Esau and Jacob might have been around about 20 at this time. Now, if so, Rebecca is probably somewhere between 60 and Isaac's age around 80 years old. Now, Isaac has just had God appear to him and reconfirm his promise to inherit the land, and yet his fear gets the better of him, and he doesn't trust God enough to protect him, as he tells this lie that she was his sister. Now, in Abraham's case, it was a half-truth, as Sarah was both his wife and his sister. Now, in this case, with Isaac, it was a full lie, as Rebecca was his cousin's daughter. Now, Abimelech is quite rightly upset with Isaac, but takes steps that no one was to touch Rebecca or Isaac for that matter. Now, had someone had taken Rebecca, things could have quite easily taken a turn for the worst, but God makes sure that things worked out. Now, if this Abimelech was not the same one from Abraham's time, no doubt he would have been familiar what had happened and did not want to incur the wrath of God. Now, Isaac's fear is also rather irrational, given the great number of armed servants that he would have had in his household, and as we'll see shortly, were more than a match for the Philistines. Now, this all leads us to our second lesson from Isaac's life, a lesson that we saw in Abraham's life. Compromises lead to inferior results and should be avoided. Now, when Abraham deceived Abimelech, he might have saved his skin, but in both cases, he almost lost his wife. That could have easily happened with Isaac had God not worked things out, which Isaac should have trusted in all along without resorting to lying. Now, the lesson for us here is to be truthful at all times and not compromise with God's laws. Now, if we fail to do so, we might have some short-term benefits, but the results in the long run will be much inferior. Now, in verses 12 to 14 of Genesis 26, we then read, "Then Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold, and the Lord blessed him. Then the man began to prosper and continued prospering until he became very prosperous, for he had possessions of flocks and possessions of herds and a great number of servants. So the Philistines envied him." Now, Albert Barnes in his commentary says the following about this passage. "The rates of increase vary from 30 to 100. 60-fold is very good and was not unusual in Palestine. 100-fold was rare and only in spots of extraordinary fertility. Now, Babylonia, however, yielded 200 and even 300-fold according to Herodotus. Thus the Lord began to bless him. The amazing growth of the stranger's wealth in flocks and herds and servants awakens the envy of the inhabitants." End of quote. Now, continuing on, we read, "Now the Philistines had stopped up all the wells which his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham his father, and they had filled them with earth. And Abimelech said to Isaac, 'Go away from us, for you are much mightier than we are.' Then Isaac departed from there and pitched his tent in the valley of Gerar and dwelt there." Now, it's interesting to note here that Abimelech states to Isaac that you are much mightier than we. Now, if you recall, when Abraham rescued Lot, he had over 300 servants born in his own household. Now, you have to bear in mind that Isaac probably has hundreds of servants and possibly even a few thousand of them in his party. Now, Albert Barnes in his commentary writes, The envious Philistines were afraid that a foreigner, a sojourner, that from a sojourner he would go on to be a settler and acquire rights of property. They accordingly took the most effectual means of making his abiding place uncomfortable when they stopped up the wells. At length the sovereign advised a separation if he did not enjoin the departure of Isaac. End of quote. Now the Philistines were not that numerous in number in Palestine at this time compared to later times. Now in Amos 9 verse 7 God says, "Did I not bring up Israel from the land of Egypt and the Philistines from Caphtor?" Now John Mimson, in an article he wrote called "The Arrival of the Philistines and the Revised Chronology," believes that the archaeological data, particularly the pottery data, best points to Cyprus rather than Crete being the original home of the Philistines. Now soon after Israel left Egypt, as implied in Amos 9:7, there was a major influx of immigrants from Cyprus to southern Palestine and a major decrease in the same culture on the island of Cyprus. Now continuing on in Genesis 26 we read, "But the herdsmen of Gerar quarrelled with Isaac's herdsmen, saying, 'The water is ours.' So he called the name of the well Esek, because they quarrelled with him. Then they dug another well, and they quarrelled over that one also, so he called its name Sitnah. And he moved from there and dug another well, and they did not quarrel over it. So he called its name Rehoboth, because he said, 'For now the Lord has made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land.' Then he went up from there," meaning up in elevation, "to Beersheba." Now Albert Barnes notes, "He digs again the old wells and calls them by the old names. He commences the digging of new ones. For the first, the herdsmen of Gerar strive, claiming the water as their own property. Isaac yields. He digs another, they strive, and again he yields. He now removes apparently into a distinct region and digs a third well for which there is no contest." End of quote. Now remember that Isaac is mightier than the Philistines, yet he humbly yields, trusting that God will provide for him wherever he chooses to abide. Now this just brings us to the third lesson that we can gain from Isaac's life. Do all that you can to live peaceably with others and trust God to provide, even if that means giving up of physical things which will assist in keeping the peace. Now Isaac lived by what Paul wrote in Romans 12 verses 18 to 21. "If it is all possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath, for it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' says the Lord. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." Now the Israelis today are doing all that they can to live peaceably with their neighbours, but as the old saying goes, it takes two to tango. You can only do your best and hope that the other party will respond in kind. Now continuing on in Genesis 26 we read, "Then Abimelech came to him from Gerar with Ahazath, one of his friends, and Pichol, the commander of his army. And Isaac said to them, 'Why have you come to me, since you hate me and have sent me away from you?' But they said, 'We have certainly seen that the Lord is with you.' So we said, 'Let there now be an oath between us, between you and us, and let's make a covenant with you that you will do us no harm, since we have not touched you, and since we have done nothing to you but good, and have sent you away in peace. You are now the blessed of the Lord.' So we made them a feast, and they ate and drank. Then they arose early in the morning and swore an oath with one another, and Isaac sent them away, and they departed from him in peace. It came to pass the same day that Isaac's servants came and told him about the well which they had dug, and said to him, 'We have found water.' So he called it Sheba. Therefore the name of the city is Beersheba to this day." So we see here that out of the blue, Abimelech with his general and another come down and seek a defensive pact that Isaac will not harm them. Now Isaac is a little surprised when they turn up, as he thought that they hated him, having asked him to leave their land. Now Abimelech really had some cheek to go on and say, "We have done nothing to you but good, and we have sent you away in peace." Now Isaac, being the peaceable guy that he was, bites his tongue and is happy to pledge that he will do them no harm, as that was his original intent anyway. He could have easily taken retribution on them with his armed servants if he was so inclined. Now remember Abimelech's comments before to Isaac that Isaac was mightier than them. Now numerically they seem to have been outnumbered by Isaac's entire party, and as they noticed how God blessed them, they sought a defensive pact to protect themselves. Now on that very same day that they sealed the covenant, Isaac's servants struck water with the well that they had dug at Beersheba, which means well of the oath. Now previously, Abraham had dug a well at Beersheba and had given 7 sheep to Abimelech as proof of ownership of the well. Now Beer means well, and Sheba is both a word for oath and also a word for 7. Now it was also here at Beersheba that God asked Abraham to take Isaac up to Moriah and offer him as a sacrifice. Now the next story in Isaac's life also takes place here, where he is tricked into giving the blessing to Jacob when he intended to give it to Esau. And much later down the track in Jacob's life, on his way down the ridge route from Shechem to Egypt to be reunited with his son Joseph, he will offer a sacrifice here at Beersheba as well. Now to Australians, Beersheba is probably best known as the location of the famous charge of the Australian Light Horse Brigade in World War I. Now Beersheba was the location of the turning point in World War I of the conquest of Palestine by the British and their allies over the Ottoman Empire. Now, late 1917, the Turks had erected a 42-kilometre stretch of trenches, barbed wire and other defences from Gaza to Beersheba. Now, hitting Gaza directly had failed twice, with 10,000 soldiers killed in those 2 attempts. Now, desperate for water, the light horsemen were instructed to use their bayonets as swords to attack the Turkish trenches. Now, the men had travelled 140 kilometres or 80 miles and had fought all day, but General Allenby said, "I must have Beersheba at its wells by sunset." Now, the Australian War Museum in London, its website gives this brief description of this battle. Now, the charge of the 4th Australian Light Horse at Beersheba late in the afternoon of 31st of October 1917 is remembered as the last great cavalry charge. Now, with time running out for the Australians to capture Beersheba and its wells before dark, Lieutenant General Harry Chauvel, the Australian commander of the Desert Mounted Corps, ordered the 4th Light Horse Brigade to make a mounted attack directly towards the town. Now, Chauvel knew from aerial photographs that the Turkish trenches in front of the town were not protected by barbed wire. The Australian Light Horse was to be used purely as cavalry for the first time. Now, as they came over the top of the ridge and looked down the long, gentle slope to Beersheba, they were seen by the Turkish gunners, who opened fire with shrapnel. But the pace was too fast for the gunners. After 3 kilometres, Turkish machine guns opened fire from the flank, but they were detected and silenced by the British artillery. The rifle fire from the Turkish trenches was wild and high as the Light Horse approached. The front trench and the main trench were jumped, and some men dismounted and then attacked the Turks with rifle and bayonet from the rear. Some galloped ahead to seize the rear trenches, while other squadrons galloped straight into Beersheba. Nearly all the wells of Beersheba were intact, and further water was available from a storm that had filled those pools. The 4th and 12th Light Horse casualties were 31 killed and 36 wounded, and they had captured 700 men. Gaza fell a week later, and on the 9th of December 1917, the British troops entered Jerusalem. End of quote. Now, one of my very favourite episodes from the Young Indiana Jones series was about the Battle of Beersheba, which featured some actually quite big names like Daniel Craig long before he became 007, Catherine Zeta-Jones, and our Aussie actor Cameron Daddo. Now, when we were in Israel, we visited the site where that famous Aussie light horse charge took place, as best as I could tell from my research. Now, the old maps put the Turkish trenches to the southeast of the old city, on the southern side of Wadi El Saba, and east of that railway that you can see there that goes over the wadi. Now, the next event that occurs in Isaac's life is when he is old and his eyesight is virtually gone, when he wishes to give Esau the blessing, which meant that Esau could be the patriarch of the family when Isaac dies. Now, this is a story that's well known to most of us here. Now, at Rebekah's instigation, Jacob tricks his father into believing he is Esau, and Isaac bestows the blessing onto him instead of Esau, who is furious when he finds out. Now, in Genesis 27:36, we read of Esau's reaction when he finds out what has happened. He says, for he, talking about Jacob, has supplanted me these 2 times. He has taken away my birthright, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing. So we see here a clear distinction between the birthright and the blessing. So what is the difference between the two? Now, on the La Vista Church of Christ website, they give a very good explanation of the difference between the birthright and the blessing in the story of Esau and Jacob. They write, a birthright referred to a person's inheritance. For most of the world's history, the firstborn child of a family would receive an extra inheritance from his father. What would happen is that when a father died, they would count his surviving children and add 1 to the count. They would then divide the inheritance that many ways, and the eldest child would get 2 portions. Thus, if a man died, having 3 surviving children, his inheritance would be divided 4 ways. The eldest child would receive 2/4, that is 1/2 of the estate, and the other 2 children would receive 1/4 of the estate each. The double portion came as a right of birth, that is, by the right of being firstborn. Now, this is what Esau sold to Jacob for a bowl of red bean stew when he returned hungry from a hunting trip. The family blessing was a way to designate who became the head of the extended family when the father died. Like the birthright, the blessing generally went to the eldest son, but not always. A change in the blessing also happened in Isaac's family. Now, before Isaac's twin sons were born, God said, 2 nations are in your womb, 2 nations shall be separated from your body, 1 people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. Now, because God placed the older son under the younger son, he was stating that the second-born was to receive the blessing. Now, Isaac, in his old age, decided to change this and give the blessing to his eldest son, Esau, anyway. However, his wife overheard his plan and arranged it so Jacob tricked Isaac into thinking that he was his brother. Thus, Isaac gave the blessing to his second son, just as God had said, even when he tried to go against God. Now, this brings us to lesson 4 of what we can learn from Isaac's life. Don't play favourites with your children. Now, it's not fair on the less favoured ones, and it can lead to resentment and envy amongst one's children. Now, we will see the same problem when we look further into the life of Jacob and the way that he treated his sons, including Joseph. Now, this point also reminds me of a Suncook commercial I saw on telly with rugby league star Jonathan Thurston. Now, there was some competition about picking your favourite state of origin games, and he commented that trying to do so was like trying to pick your favourite child. And then he cheekily said with a smile, "You've got one, you're just not allowed to say which one." Now, in Genesis 27 and 28, we then read, "And Rebekah said to Isaac, I am weary of my life because of the daughters of Heth. If Jacob takes a wife of the daughters of Heth, like these, who are the daughters of the land, what good will my life be to me? Then Isaac called Jacob and blessed him and charged him and said to him, You shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. Arise, go to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take yourself a wife from there of the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. So Isaac sent Jacob away, and he went to Padan Aram. Now Joseph is born when Jacob has served his 2 lots of 7 years for Leah and Rachel. Now from other information we have in the book of Genesis, we know that Jacob was 91 when Joseph was born. Now this means that Jacob was still single and was 77 years old when he left for Padan Aram. Now he would be there for 20 years and be about 97 when he returned to the land of Canaan. Now this also means that Isaac was 137 years old when Jacob tricks Isaac into giving him the blessing, and was 157 when Jacob returned. Now we're going to look more closely at the customs of patriarchal society when I cover lessons from the life of Isaac's son Jacob next time. Now one of these customs in patriarchal society was that you would not leave your household without seeking the consent of the patriarch. Now Rebekah has found a way to put some distance between Jacob and Esau to help prevent Esau from bringing harm to Jacob. Now, at Rebekah's prompting, Isaac gives him formal permission to leave and find a wife amongst his own ancestral people and race in Padan Aram. Now, Jacob will end up there for about 20 years, working 2 lots of 7 years for each of his 2 wives, and father a dozen children before he returns to the land of Canaan. Now, when Jacob was away, Isaac, expecting Jacob to return at some stage, must have decided it was best to send Esau away so he would not need to be under Jacob's lawful authority when he died, given how he cheated Esau to gain that right to become the patriarch. Now Isaac tried to make good of a bad situation as Esau went to Mount Seir, and he became very rich by the time that Jacob returned. Now this actually took the wind out of Esau's desire to avenge himself on Jacob. He had what he actually thought he'd lost to Jacob. Esau then was a patriarch in his own right, separate from Jacob, and he was very prosperous. And at that time, Esau welcomes Jacob, and the 2 brothers are peacefully reunited. Now at that time, Isaac was 157 years old, and he's probably blind by this stage, and he will live another 23 years in the area of Hebron. Now, before I started preparing for this message, I'd actually assumed that Isaac had died before Jacob had come back. But we clearly see when we look carefully that Isaac did live long enough to see his, well, not necessarily see, but hear his sons are reunited again. Now we read in Genesis 35, Then Jacob came to his father Isaac at Mamre, or Kirjath Arba, that is Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac had dwelt. Now the days of Isaac were 180 years. So Isaac breathed his last and died, and was gathered to his people, being old and full of days. And his sons Isaac and Jacob were buried with him. They buried him, not with him. Now Jacob was primarily based in Shechem after his return, and Isaac is based at Mamre near Hebron. Now both his sons are there to help bury him in his ancestral burial place at the Machpelah cave in Hebron. Now, while not perfect, Isaac did live a godly life, and he was a great example of obedience, submission, and being a man of peace. Now, let's learn from his examples in these 4 lessons that we've looked at today. 1, be submissive to the Father's will like Isaac was, who was willing to give up his life to obey God. 2, avoid compromises which lead to inferior results. 3, do all you can to live peaceably with others and trust God to provide, even if giving up physical things will assist in keeping the peace. And 4, don't play favourites with your children. So that concludes lessons from Isaac. When I'm up here again on August 10, I believe, I will continue the series on the patriarchs, and we'll look at the first of a 3-part series on the life of Jacob. Thank you.